It's referendum week on the Elias Makos show. Yeah, indeed. It's referendum week on the Elias Makos show. That's because Thursday will mark the 30th anniversary of the 1995 referendum. And some of you may remember, some of you may not. Some of you were probably too young for the referendum. But boy, did it come so close to this country being torn apart. 50.58% to 49.42%. That was the final result of that referendum. So all week, we're going to be looking back at the 1995 referendum. Today, we go inside the Chrétien government and take a time machine to the weeks and months ahead of the 1995 referendum, try and figure out how the federal government was dealing with the possibility of Quebec separation. Our tremendous pleasure to welcome Eddie Goldenberg onto the program was Jean Chrétien's senior policy advisor during the 1995 referendum. Mr. Goldenberg, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
What does it feel like now? When the calendar passes, it's 30 years. How does it feel like to look back 30 years ago?
Well, it feels like you're a bit older than you were at the time. That's not a great feeling. Yeah. But what does it look like? Well, 30 years later, the support for separation is very low. There's a poll last week that shows that most Quebecers, including most members of the Parti Québécois, don't even want a new referendum. So I think that's pretty good. I think that 30 years later, or 30 years ago, there was you talk about how close it was. It was close in one sense, but the question was a trick question. The question wasn't a simple question, do you want to separate, yes or no? It was a question designed for a yes answer, and they didn't get a yes answer.
Uh-huh.
And the result of that was the Clarity Act. I remember the night of the referendum, Prime Minister Chrétien saying to me, I will never allow a question like that again, and we're going to have legislation. And from now on, as a result of that, if there were ever a referendum, the question would have to be, do you want Quebec to separate from Canada, no longer be a province of Canada? That's very different than the question was 30 years ago.
Well, you know what? I'm so happy you brought it up, right? Because, I wrote the question into my notes here for this segment today because I said we got to talk a little bit about the question. Let me read, for those who don't know, maybe our listeners that are a little bit too young, because that actually is a thing now. We have listeners who are too young for the referendum.
No, of course.
So here was the question. Do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign after having made a formal offer to Canada for a new economic and political partnership within the scope of the bill respecting the future of Quebec and of the agreement signed on June 12, 1995? Woo! Not so simple, right, to figure that one out.
Not only that, but the agreement signed June 12th was an agreement between the Parti Québécois, the Bloc Québécois, and there's a provincial party as well.
Yes.
It was a deliberate question to get a yes answer, and they didn't get it. And that's what's most important.
Okay, but having said that, they almost did get their yes answer, and it would have brought the country to, I don't even want to imagine where it would have brought us here. So
no, it would have been tough. It would have been tough, no doubt about that.
So what do you remember of that when the polls weren't looking good? Take us back to the months and weeks and days leading up to the referendum.
Well, I think, if I look back at it, for quite a while, the polls were looking very good. And we on the Federalist side were probably a bit complacent. And then mid-October, so maybe about 2 weeks before, I don't remember exactly the date, the separatist movement, Premier Parizeau at the time realized he couldn't win because he was not very popular. Mm. And Lucien Bouchard was the leader of the Bloc Québécois. Monsieur Bouchard had just come through a terrible illness and almost risen from the dead. And when Parizeau named him the chief negotiator, that was very important for Quebecers, because for Quebecers, a negotiation is normal, and it doesn't usually end in anything that is fundamentally different. So Quebecers a lot of people looked at it and say, well, we can vote yes, there'll be an economic partnership and a political partnership, and life will basically go on as is. Whereas Parizeau, Premier Jacques Parizeau, was prepared to declare independence. So the Federalist forces, we were in a coalition, the federal people in the federal government with the provincial Liberals. And the mistake we made in hindsight, I believe, is we argued too much on the basis of economics, that it would not be good economically for Quebec to separate. And we should have argued on the basis of Canadian patriotism, that it is very, that Canada is a wonderful country to be part of. That was done in 1980. It was not done in 1995, and that was a mistake. But as I said, at the end of the day, we still won.
We're with Eddie.
Even if it was close.
And even if it was close. We're with Eddie Goldenberg, who was Jean Chrétien's senior policy advisor during the 1995 referendum. Thursday is the 30th anniversary of that referendum. Mr. Goldenberg, why don't you take me to the days right before the vote? What was the atmosphere like inside Jean Chrétien's office?
We were nervous. I mean, there was a very big speech that Prime Minister Chrétien made in Verdun a couple of days before the referendum. And I remember that morning, our polling showed that we were 7 points behind.
Wow.
And I phoned him. It was about 7:30 in the morning. And he said, "What's new?" And I said, "Well, Prime Minister, we have good news and bad news." And he said, "What's the bad news?" And I said, "The bad news is we're 7 points behind." And he said, "What's the good news?" I said, "The good news is we're expecting you to turn it around tonight." And he said, "Well, I guess that's why I get paid less than the worst player in the National Hockey League."
Unbelievable. Now,
so we had there was a bit of gallows humor, but it was tough. It was tough. The Prime Minister went on national television a couple of days before the referendum, used the provision in the Broadcasting Act to capture the airwaves. I thought it was very important, less by what he said than by the very fact of doing it and telling Quebecers, look, don't kid yourselves, this is really serious. And, as I say, at the end of the day, we won. But you're right, it was the last week was very, very difficult. And we were, I won't say throwing Jell-O at the wall, but we were trying to figure out what would stick best. And I think that what stuck best, in my mind, was the Prime Minister's speech on television. Because I think, as I just said, I think it woke people up to the fact that, hey, this is really serious, and we better understand that if we're voting yes, we could break up a country we don't want to break up.
You were talking about strategy before and the focus on economics and not enough focus on patriotism and why Canada is a great country. But there was that rally, right? That big no rally. That,
right.
I remember even as a kid, I remember how big that was, even though I wasn't there. Could that have been, the final push to pull on those patriotism heartstrings? Do you think that had an impact here in getting us over the finish line?
It took place, if I'm not mistaken, on the Saturday before the referendum. Some people think it had a huge impact. Others think it didn't have an impact, that it was too late. I don't know. I can't judge that, but it did have a very big impact in the rest of Canada, where people said, "Hey, we did something. We helped save our country." That, I think, was really important. Whether it changed a lot of votes in the last minute, my instinct is that it didn't, but others think that it did. And as I said, at the end of the day, we won.
And at the end of the day, when the numbers come in, 50.58 to 49.42. What was happening? What was the reaction? What was happening internally?
Well, I watched it with the Prime Minister at the Prime Minister's residence, which was then 24 Sussex, and there was a lot of nervousness. I mean, I remember we were watching it upstairs on the television with a number of advisors and family around, and I remember myself going down to try to find a different television so I could be by myself, and others followed me. So none of us were ever by ourselves. Yeah. And then, the final results came in, and it was a big, satisfaction or we weren't happy, but we were satisfied. Thank God we won.
Listen, I'm running up against the clock, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question.
Sure.
Did your side, did the no side, or did the yes side, the we side, did either of you play dirty at all during this referendum campaign?
Well, I think that there were a lot of folks in Federalist area, very much Federalist parts of Montreal that were not counted. And my view is that the fact that the yes side didn't demand a recount says a lot about whether or not they played dirty.
Wow, we'll leave it there, Mr. Goldenberg. Thank you so much for kicking off our referendum week. I think we picked the right person.
And good luck this week. Good luck this week.
Thank you so much. Eddie Goldenberg was Jean Chrétien's senior policy advisor during the 1995 referendum.
I'm Dylan Playfair.
And I'm Tyler Smith.
We're putting loneliness in the penalty box by talking to some of our favorite athletes about the importance of friendship.
This is Bromance.
Bromance is brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, proudly Canadian-owned and operated. Charm has been part of your love stories and bromances for over 50 years. And you can find Bromance on the iHeartRadio network or wherever you get your podcasts.